Autism has increased 241% since the year 2000. According to the CDC, 1 in 36 children in the U.S. are on the spectrum. My next guest is the founder and executive director of Documenting Hope, a nonprofit research organization that for the last 15 years has collaborated with physicians, parents, scientists, and health organizations to examine the cumulative impact of environmental stressors to rethink the way we approach children's health. Today, she's going to share her research findings and what has worked for other parents as we ask the questions, why and what now when it comes to autism? Asking hard questions, collaborating for the future, and optimizing the good, Beth Lambert. Thanks for doing this, Beth.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Meredith.
We have so much to go over, and so I just want to dive right into the hard questions. Have recently read that ADHD and some mild sensory preferences have been included into the spectrum of what we consider autism. And, just as I was reading these numbers about a 241% increase since the year 2000, I can't help but wonder if that increase in diagnosis is because we are diagnosing more broadly or misdiagnosing.
Well, I think it's not one answer. We are better at diagnosing autism. We're better at diagnosing the things that are considered to be on the spectrum of autism. So that's the ADHD and sensory processing disorder and learning disabilities. I mean, there is a set of diagnostic criteria that we use to determine whether a child has autism or sensory processing disorder. But there's a lot of gray area, even in that diagnostic category. And all those things require subjective diagnosis. So it's not like you get a blood test for autism or a blood test for ADHD. So it's not clear cut. So that makes the diagnostic statistics a little bit gray. We have more awareness. We have more professionals who are trained to do the diagnosis. So there's no doubt that we're better at diagnosing, which is going to result in more kids being diagnosed. But it does not explain how we're seeing exponential increases in all of these conditions. And there have been epidemiologists who have looked at this very question, are we better at diagnosing or are there just more kids? And the answer is both. We're both better at diagnosing and there's just more kids. And there actually are biomarkers that you can look at to determine whether a kid might have ADHD or autism. It's just that they haven't been cleared by the FDA as a clinical diagnostic test yet, although that's coming soon. I think that will alleviate a lot of people's concerns as to whether we're actually diagnosing kids who have some kind of physiological condition or whether we're just pathologizing normal behaviors. And I think we're doing a little bit of both, but a clear diagnostic test, like a blood test, would clear up a lot of the confusion.
Wow. Okay. So talk to me about the total load concept when it comes to causes.
So a lot of times people think autism is genetic, brain-based, lifelong. These are sort of just these preconceived notions about what we think autism is. Autism is actually something that develops over time from actually preconception all the way through the first few years of life.
Wait,
Critical.
preconception? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
that is like way outside of what I know about. Can you unpack preconception
Yeah.
autism a little bit?
So going back to this concept of total load, it is this idea that the body only has so much capacity to handle health stressors. That could be things like toxins, or it could be things like emotional stressors. It could be immunological stressors like infections, things like that. The body only has so much capacity. And when it exceeds that capacity to deal with those kinds of stressors during a critical developmental window, that's when you begin to see neurobehavioral and neurodevelopmental impact. That's when you start seeing what we call autism or other kinds of behavioral, neurodevelopmental conditions emerge. That starts at preconception. Why? Because mom and dad, when they prepare to have a child, their bodies have been interacting with the environment decades, right? For as long as they've been alive. And their immune system has certain responses that it learns over that time. So there is some research out of the University of Texas by a researcher by the name of Claudia Miller, who has documented that what mom and dad are exposed to in a preconception environment actually can impact the health outcomes of the child. So, for instance, mom is, let's say, becomes sensitive to chemicals. So, let's say she works in a factory where she's around a lot of synthetic fragrances or other kinds of petrochemicals. Her body develops what's known as multiple chemical sensitivity. That actually is her immune system reacting to those chemicals in her environment and trying to protect herself from it. That is an immune system priming that is actually carried along the germline and impacts an egg that is fertilized and becomes a baby. So the DNA is impacted at a level of the preconception. But every single time that, let's say, that fertilized egg that becomes the fetus, that becomes the child, every time it is impacted by a chemical or something like that, it will impact the child's ability to respond itself. It primes their immune system, so their immune system is more reactive.
Wow. That is not anything I even considered. I like the way that you explain how it's a reaction to the environment, because what's really delicate in this conversation is how to talk about options and causality without shaming and blaming. And, moms notoriously, I feel like when God made women, he's like, here's your uterus, here's some guilt, have fun. Like it's just within our nature, I guess. Okay, so continue on down the road of the total load concept after preconception for us.
So when the child is in utero, everything that that mom is exposed to, she's sharing with the baby in utero. So that could be things like heavy metals, chemicals. It could be emotional stressors that create excessive cortisol in the body. So there's hormones that be circulating in the baby's system. And then when the baby is born, the baby acquires essentially the microbiome of the mother. And when that happens, whatever the mother's microbiome imbalances are, that is passed along to the baby in the vaginal canal. Or if the baby is not born vaginally, is born by C section, then that baby acquires sort of the microbial environment of the hospital setting. So right from the beginning, that baby is basically taking on that same kind of health status of the mother. And if that microbiome is imbalanced, if there's too much of some pathogenic type microbes, not enough of the commensal or helpful type of microbes, that baby is going to be vulnerable to stressors that they will interact with on the outside world. So if the baby comes into contact with chemicals or heavy metals or other kinds of health stressors, their body is not going to have the capacity to be able to detoxify as effectively, because those microbes in our gut, that's one of their primary jobs, is to actually help us detox the things that we are exposed to in our environment. So it's really just, you think about it like a path, right? Starts at preconception, then goes in utero, baby has exposure, then it goes into that neonatal period when the baby's just beginning to grow and develop and learn how to do things like develop vision and process different kinds of stimulus, auditory stimulus, tactile stimulus, all these critical developmental things that need to happen in the first year of life. But if that baby is dealing with toxic chemicals, cortisol that's pumping from mom, or let's say different kinds of immune stressors, that baby is going to spend all of his energy on fighting those stressors, on the survival that is required to deal with those stressors. And that energy that normally would go towards vision and hearing and motor development, that is going to be interrupted, stalled, impaired. That's why we see developmental issues. This is autism is like, everybody thinks it's such a mystery, but what it is a developmental trajectory that's been interrupted. And why is it interrupted? Because the baby is too busy dealing with a total load of modern living stressors that it doesn't put enough of its resources on normal human development. It's the total load of living in the modern world that is just too much for our children. It affects them during their critical developmental years. And that's why you see developmental issues. That's why you see autism. That's why you see learning disabilities. That's why you see delays in walking, talking, crawling. All of those things are because that baby's total load was too much in that really important developmental window.
That need to defend against environmental toxins, I mean, I'm tempted to say it's not new, but there are definitely like new ingredients, right? But I think about specifically, I have this movie in my head right now of like London in the 1800s. Literally, people were throwing their shit on the street.
Mhm.
So I'm like, well, how come? I mean, that was obviously environmental toxins. Like people were burning coal to keep warm in their house. That was environmental toxins. In the 80s, people smoked inside on
Mhm.
airplanes, even, which is unfathomable to us right now. So, what's the significance of, timeline milestones that have made this particular combination of environmental impacts unovercomable
Yeah.
for young people now?
It's such a great question because we all think about, I mean, I grew up as a kid in the 70s and the 80s, and I'm pretty sure I was surrounded by lots of toxic things that were not good for me, and I'm okay, right? So how come I didn't develop autism? The reason is because what's happening to our kids now is this is like a multifactorial, an assault from multiple fronts. So first of all, if you think about the toxic load, it is more than it's ever been. We have 80,000 chemicals on the market that have never been tested. We have quite literally tens of thousands of new molecules that are being thrown into the environment, into the consumer marketplace that we have no idea whether they're carcinogenic, whether they're endocrine disrupting. We have no idea. So there are just more synthetic chemicals available. It's one thing where the human immune system developed over millennia to be able to deal with, say, something that's toxic, like burning wood and the smoke from that. That's toxic to the body. But we've had millennia to adapt to that and learn how to overcome that. Our body doesn't know what to do with these synthetic chemicals, all these petrochemicals that are brand new to the body. I think the other piece to this, though, is that I talked about the microbiome before. I think the microbiome is one of the most important pieces of this whole puzzle, in that the microbiome is our first line of defense against all kinds of toxic assaults. So if you don't have a robust and diverse microbiome, you're actually not going to be able to detoxify and excrete all the things that you need to from your body. Some researchers, when they started first looking at the microbiome, looked at what would happen to mice or an organism if you took out their microbiome and what would happen to their ability to detoxify. So, this group of researchers took two groups of mice. One group of mice had been given antibiotics and the other group had not. Then they fed both groups of mice methylmercury, which is a known neurotoxin. It stores itself in your fatty tissues, your brain, and your liver. Each group of mice were fed methylmercury. And the group of mice that had received the antibiotics before they were fed the mercury, they retained the mercury in their fatty tissues. The group of mice that had not received the antibiotics excreted the mercury in their stool. So, what does that tell you? That tells you how critical the microbiome is for helping us detoxify. And there's other things that go into our ability. So, for instance, we know that the liver has certain nutrients it needs, certain detoxification pathways that are required to excrete toxins from our body. And there's certain nutrients in our diet that we need, like sulfur compounds, like things in onions and garlic and cruciferous vegetables that help support our detoxification pathways. But if children aren't eating those kinds of nutrients, they're not going to be able to detoxify as well. So it's kind of this perfect storm or compounding effect where there's more toxins. They're newer, they're synthetic, they're a different set of toxins. And then on top of that, we also have a microbiome that is universally been perturbed by modern living. Most people in the United States and most of the modern Western world have taken antibiotics at some point. Usually, people have taken round upon round upon round of antibiotics. Every strep throat, every ear infection, kids have been treated for antibiotics. So we know that the current generation of children are probably kids who have microbiomes that are just out of whack and out of balance. And that means they're not going to detoxify as well. So that's, I think, a major factor. And on top of that, you also have the childhood schedule that kids are getting from birth, they get right in the hospital all the way through the first couple of years of lives, where those are known to impact the microbiome and they're known to cause immune dysregulation in some children. So it's, again, compounding. It's never one thing. The total load is too great, and we have a decreased capacity to be able to handle it due to poor nutrition, due to microbiome disruptions, and other kinds of stressors that weren't part of the pre-modern world.
So, microbiome, I was researching about fecal matter transplant
Hmm.
and kind of stumbled into this topic years ago. There was one study in 2019 from Arizona State University where they studied a group of people with autism, and 2 years after an FMT, they showed 50% reduction in their autism symptoms. So I wanted to ask you, is there any new studies on FMT as a promising protocol for kids, especially with autism?
I know there are new studies that are looking to be funded in FMT. Arizona State University, Dr. Jim Adams is actually looking to fund additional research in that area. And Dr. Sabine Hazen is also looking to fund that research for autism specifically. Right now, fecal microbiome transplant has not been approved for clinical trials in the United States. You can get fecal microbiome transplants for C. difficile, There's other indications, but right now there isn't an active trial that's available. So that we have a lot of research that needs to be done in this area, and it requires some funding. There are anecdotal evidence from fecal microbiome transplant clinics all over the world, and people are seeing remission from conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or MS or other kinds of autoimmune conditions. And one of the things not many people know is that autism is largely an autoimmune condition. It's a developmental condition. But often, why it persists and why these kids don't catch up developmentally is because they're fighting a constant autoimmune process in their bodies. So, researchers have identified that there's autoimmune antibodies to brain tissue, to gastrointestinal tract tissue. These kids are actually just constantly inflamed. They are in a state of inflammation. So, what in theory, the success that you've seen with all these autoimmune diseases with FMT and the reversal of that autoimmune process would have an impact in autism as well.
Well, how does a parent who is trying to put themselves in the driver's seat of care for their child who has autism, how do they navigate this safely? Because part of what I stumbled across with this line of research was a naturopathic physician called Jason Klopp, who recently had his license revoked. He's Canadian. And there was some rumors that there was like stool samples being collected in a basement in Mexico. And, of course, parents want to do whatever it takes, but how do you do that safely when potentially the lack of permission from the FDA and lack of funding for these research projects kind of pushes people to the fringe?
Right. I think that's a serious concern, what you just described, which is that there isn't a lot of support for the things that in theory should work. FMT would be one example. There are others. There's different kinds of platelet therapies, for instance, that might be helpful. And because these things aren't being funded to the degree they are, people are left exploring options on their own. At the end of the day, we spend a lot of time thinking about all these fancy therapies, this high tech therapy that's going to help us reverse the autoimmune process or help us reverse autism in children. But what have I've seen over the last 15 years, as I've been collecting stories of children who have fully reversed their autism diagnosis, is that the people that experience that kind of remission with autism are the ones who go back to the fundamentals, the foundations of reducing their child's total load, changing the way that that family lives, changing their diet, changing their environment, changing their mindset. I have not seen one case of autism reversal, and I have documented probably hundreds over the 15 years that I've been doing this work. I have not seen one case of a remission of autism symptoms without a massive diet overhaul, without a massive environment overhaul, and a massive mindset shift. And this isn't to say that this is necessarily possible for every child. I mean, there are so many kids that are so severely impacted that it's a long road to get to that place. But I will say that we might be spending a lot of time looking for that like scientific miracle or the quick fix or the shortcut. But at the end of the day, these kids got where they are because of a synergy and compounding of lots of environmental factors that was just too much for their body. And the other thing I'll say is that with autism in particular, which is different from a lot of the autoimmune diseases I'm referencing, there's that developmental piece. So you not only have to clean up the body, clean up the diet, change the environment, you also need to go back and revisit those developmental milestones because human beings have to go through a certain process that nature has perfected over thousands and thousands of years that gets humans to talk, to walk, to think complex thoughts, to have vision and all these really amazing, beautiful human traits, but it requires a developmental process. And if you got that developmental process interrupted, you actually have to go back and revisit that pathway in order to get back on a normal developmental trajectory.
It's true that I think in the West especially, we love to buy our solutions. We're like, well, can I Amazon Prime that to
Right.
my house?
It's true.
And so there's that temptation. We also love to blame. We like to single out something that we can protest about or that we can boycott, like, oh, it's the subcutaneous interventions, like let's be anti that and anti this. So if we look at this cause from the total load perspective, how do we navigate that without wearing tinfoil hats, right? Because it's like phthalates and PFAS and Wi-Fi. Oh my, how are you supposed to do that and work a job and, have a spouse and stuff?
Yeah. Well, it seems on face value very overwhelming.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because this is a cultural problem. This isn't something that has been around for thousands of years. I mean, there's people that will argue that autism has been around forever and it's not an epidemic, and that's actually just not true. Autism may be some iteration, some version of autism, meaning that there's humans who've been developmentally delayed. Yeah, sure, that's been around for thousands of years, but not on this epidemic level. And I think we have to sort of take the long view on this and remember that we didn't have 1 in 30 kids some kind of autism diagnosis, and 1 in 6 kids with a developmental disability or learning disability. That's the statistic. 1 in 6 in the modern
Wow.
industrial world has some kind of developmental or learning disability. So that should tell you that we need to go back to how people used to live and compare it to how we're living today. This is a function of living in the modern world. And so that means it's cultural. It means what we're eating, it's what we're doing, it's the practices we have every day. And we have to really remember that really has only been in place really since kind of the post World War II industrial era. It's not that long that we've changed the way that we're living. It almost is guidance for us to go back to our ancestral roots and go back to the ways that people lived before the modern industrial era and lived in rhythm with nature. We are so caught up in how we live now as if that's the only way to be, but it's a very short period of time that we've been living in this toxic soup. And by the way, these kids are here to tell us that we are killing the planet, we are killing ourselves. And if we don't wake up, we're all going to be impacted this way. This is our wake up call. These are our canaries in the coal mine telling us that if we don't do something different, if we don't change the way that we're living, we're all going to be impacted. So it does feel overwhelming when you're like, I can't go eat at Chick-fil-A anymore. And oh my gosh, the fluorescent bulbs are dangerous. And oh my goodness, there's fluoride in the water and red dye number 4 in that cereal. What if you just dropped everything that was like the shiny, new, modern, stuff we surround ourselves with and just go back to the basics? Like, look at how your grandmother lived or your great grandmother and try and do more of that sort of, you know, basic living that isn't so fast paced and so technological and it's a little bit more grounded in who we are as human beings and who we've always been. We've really lost touch with that. And I do believe that our kids are here to show us that we've lost touch with what it means to be human, what it means to live in rhythm with nature and to live in sync with nature. The further we go away from nature, the worse our kids get, the sicker they get, the more complex their health and developmental problems. So we can either take that as a wake up call, or we can reject it. And then we just have to deal with what we're dealing with.
I would imagine that a lot of parents would be open to the idea of making adjustments at minimal or overhauls at the max. But it's that, where do I start? You need support, you kind of need community, and you kind of need, I don't know, other examples. So, talk to me about how you're collaborating with physicians, MDs, PhDs on collecting this data and making it applicable to families that are willing to make the changes.
We have so much medical literature that tells us all the things that are health supporting and all the things that are hurting our health. Like, we know about that. But the research that people haven't done yet is looking at the compounding, the synergistic impact of all these things together. So we actually designed a research study. It's called the CHIRP study, and it collects data about how people are living in the modern world, how children are living in the modern world. And we are trying to better understand what happens if you add up all those stressors, if you add up all those toxins together. What does that look like when you compare it to health outcomes? So we started this study in 2018, and it's a survey for parents to fill out. And we ask them everything you can imagine, from preconception through that prenatal period, through those early developmental years, right into the child's current moment. And we ask about their health, and we ask about their health symptoms and diagnoses and all these kinds of ways of measuring health. And what we found is that it's validating this total load hypothesis, that the more stressors a child has, the worse the health outcomes are. So it's actually something that we need to better understand as a society, because that tells us what to do to protect our children. It's actually pretty simple. If you know and understand that total load matters, you can also then understand that reducing the total load is going to have an impact on improving your child's health. I say to people kind of like the 80-20 rule, right? Which is you do as much as you can to reduce the total load on your child. Swap out cleaners in your house for safer ones. Like you can go on to EWG, Environmental Working Group, has a great website where you can find safe, non toxic cleaners. Swap out personal care products. Same thing. They have something called the Skin Deep database where you can swap out the toxic personal care products. You can start swapping out processed, ultra processed foods with all the preservatives and the additives and all these seed oils and things that are inflammatory, and you can replace that with whole foods that, again, go back to how your great grandmother cooked and ate. So those are the things that we can do, that we can take action on. We have control over those things as parents. Like we have to feed our children 3 times a day. So when you do that, take it seriously. Like it's not just a thing you do in passing on your way to sports practice or something you do in passing as you're hustling to work. We have to shift and think intentionally about how we're feeding our children and how we are raising them, and what kind of environment we're raising them. And if you take that total load concept to heart, you don't have to get everything right. You don't have to have every single toxin out there out of your life. But if you can just lean into natural and reduce as many of those exposures as possible, it's going to make a difference. We've also tested the hypothesis that what happens if you reduce a child's total load? What does that do? We started a second study called the Flight Study, where we actually put that into practice. And we enrolled a couple children in this study, and we're going to be enrolling some more this coming year, where we are asking the families to identify all the things in their child's environment that might be toxic. We're asking the families to change their diet. We're asking the families to change the rhythm and pace of their life and try and slow things down and try and get back in touch with nature. And then we're measuring whether that makes an impact on children's symptoms and diagnoses. And so for the children that we've had enrolled already, it has made an impact. When you address these stressors, when you reduce that total load, it makes an impact. It improves their health. It reduces their symptoms. And we're continuing to explore this. I feel like it's very important for this kind of work to be further funded study because we have this great hypothesis. I've been documenting these stories of recovery for 15 years, and every single one of these families reduced their child's total load and increased their health supports. Now that's anecdotal information. I feel really good that that's a good path forward for people who want to prevent and reverse conditions. But now we need to really bring that out into the world and really test it so that we can say confidently that this is the path. This is what you need to do to prevent these conditions. And this is what you need to do to reverse them. So we have a medical and scientific advisory board that has been guiding us through creating these research studies. And we're really trying to scale our work now so we can bring this to more children, gather more evidence, and make a case that total load matters and that we as parents need to be taking it seriously.
I want to move on to some options and resources, treatments type stuff for parents, like practical nitty gritty as we could possibly get, even though each child is different. But before we do that, can you share with me the twins case report? Because this was kind of the email that I got from fellow podcaster Sean Stevenson of the Model Health Show that kind of put me on the path for us to have this conversation.
Yeah, so as I've mentioned, we have been documenting cases of children who have fully reversed their conditions, which means they've lost their diagnosis, everything from rheumatoid arthritis and MS, life threatening food allergies to autism and ADHD. I've been documenting these cases. I've been capturing them on film. I've been writing about them. And, if you look in the medical literature, there's very scant evidence for children that have reversed their autism diagnosis. There's some, but there's probably like less than 10 cases in the medical literature. So when you go to your pediatrician and you say, my child has autism, but I heard that it's reversible, the pediatrician will say, well, there's no evidence for that. And then they'll discourage you from doing anything, towards that. We knew we needed to change that. So we have begun a case report initiative, which is to go to these cases, these fresh, brand new cases of families who fully reverse their children's, whether it's autism or other conditions. And we are taking their evidence, things that they have been capturing from day one that demonstrates or proves that their children have lost their diagnosis. So these would be cases of families who've documented everything. I was one of these parents who, with my kids, I had every head circumference documented and every blood draw. I had all the metrics. I mean, some people are like that. So we have a family who applied to participate in our flight study. I was telling you about that intervention study a moment ago. And we weren't able to take them into the study because we didn't have funding to take any more children. And it was a set of twin girls who had autism, a level 3 or severe autism, diagnosed at Walter Reed, which is a very legitimate institution. And these families, while they couldn't participate in our intervention study, they basically created a version of it on their own. So their objective was to go out and reduce their children's total load. They changed their diet, they changed their environment, they did all these personalized therapeutics to help their children get back on a typical developmental trajectory. And after about 18 months, the one twin completely lost her diagnosis, and the other one went from a severe level 3 down to a level 1. And since then, her ATEC, which is a way of measuring how severe she's impacted, since then her ATEC has even come down more. And I'm certain within a few more months, she'll have no longer have a diagnosis. So we published this paper where, again, we had everything documented by this family because this family was awesome. They kept every paper, every lab test, every appointment they went to. They documented it so well. So we actually went and organized this into a case report, and we published it in the Journal of Personalized Medicine, which is a peer-reviewed journal. And there's a couple of these types of case reports out there, but never quite this rigorous because this family did a great job. So we actually have a second case report that we're working on now that we're putting into peer review as well. This was a case of a boy who had autism, who used a specific carbohydrate diet, which was essentially a way to try and change his microbiome through food. What a novel idea, right? Like that's something everybody can do. Everybody can change diet and everybody can try and modulate what's in your microbiome through food. So that will be coming out soon. And the thing that was so incredible about this publication, we did this, it just came out this past summer, was that people were shocked. Shocked. I mean, we got media coverage from all over the world. We couldn't believe the response that people had to this case report. I mean, it's a really compelling story, right? Like these twin girls, severely affected with autism. Had they not intervened, they would have grown up, might have needed to be institutionalized. That's what their doctors were saying. But
Oh gosh.
instead, the parents took a different track. And now these girls are typically developing. They have friends. You can't distinguish them from their peers. So, of course, people were like, how is this even possible? I thought autism was genetic. I thought it was something you have for your life. But we just demonstrated with this family that that's not the case. And we are continuing to do these case reports because we need to build a body of evidence that these conditions are not static. Despite what the conventional medical community says, they are not static. They are changeable. And even if you have something chromosomal like Down syndrome, which is a chromosomal thing, you can't change the chromosome. So they'll always have Down syndrome. But even in that case, you can improve the metabolic health of that child so that their cognitive function improves, so that their motor function improves, so that their developmental trajectory is better. So every child, even if there's a like frank genetic component, which autism is not, unless it's the case of Rut's or Fragile X or something like that, but very rarely is autism solely genetic. Even if it were solely genetic, you can still improve people's function, health, and overall ability to just have a normal and typical life just through these kinds of interventions.
So, when you have talked about removing toxins, you've given generalized advice, I'll say, that applies to everyone. Because I'm kind of like reading in between the lines of what you're like. You mentioned BPAs, for example.
Mhm.
So, like removing, plastic, microplastics, and things that are known endocrine disruptors. You mentioned synthetic fragrances, chemicals that are in most of our cleaning supplies. So those are all very general. But when you're talking about diet, I haven't heard you say any one diet. Is it different based on the microbiome status of each individual child? And that's something that they have to kind of experiment with?
Yes. So so
Okay.
yes and no. I mean, first of all, there's some general principles I think everybody can apply to diet changes. One would be whole foods, organic foods across the board. Don't eat anything unless it's organic. That's the way, before the 1960s, everything was organic. There was no like industrial farming where we sprayed everything or we had GMOs and, glyphosate everywhere. If you can choose to have clean food, that's going to help your immune system. That's going to take the total load down. The second principle would be whole food. Don't eat processed foods. Don't eat anything out of a box or a package. When it beyond that, though, it's extremely bio-individual because what one person's microbiome looks like as compared to another is as unique as a fingerprint. People who are sequencing the guts of kids with autism are finding that they have reduced diversity, right? So they have too much of one type or one classification of microbe and not enough diversity of the many types that you need. And it's just like a garden. In order to be thriving, you need to have a diversity of different kinds of species in there. I mean, luckily today, there's lots of different stool tests that you can do. They're not perfect because the microbiome, a lot of people say, is like the final frontier. Like we still don't have a good grasp of what's going on in the gut because by the time the stool gets out, your microbial picture changes. But there are some good tools. For example, there's a company called Tiny Health that focuses specifically on children and children's guts. And they have this direct to consumer, and you can do a stool sample and you can actually see what's in your microbiome. And they give food recommendations based on what's in your microbiome. So, for instance, you have
Hmm.
too much of one species, they're going to say cut out the simple sugars, for instance, because the simple sugars feed this species and you have too much of it. And you don't have enough of this other type of species, which actually requires fiber. And they'll give you very specific recommendations based on what's there. Now, it's not like it's static, right? Your microbiome changes moment to moment, and it can change not just by food, it also can change based on the water you're drinking. If you're drinking tap water, the American tap water is just horrific. It is filled with chemicals, and you can actually go to EWG, Environmental Working Group, has a tap water database, so you can see what's in there. You can test your own water with a company called TapScore.
Hmm.
So you are absolutely right that everybody's diet needs to be bio-individual. Using your microbiome as a guide is one way to improve your health, but you can also tailor your diet based on your nutritional needs. So there are tests you can take. One example is a test called NutriVal that you can see what your nutrient status looks like. So that's another way to guide your diet. And there's many types of diets out there. On our website, we have an examination of different types of diets because there is no one size fits all for this. Many children, especially children on the spectrum, they have food sensitivities or allergies. And when they eat certain foods, it puts them in a state of inflammation. Many of these kids have sensitivities or allergies to wheat and dairy, soy, corn. Those are the most common ones. And so when they eat these foods, it literally keeps them in that state of chronic inflammation. So a lot of times people will do an elimination diet. Well, they'll take out some of those sources of inflammation by
Well, that
individual.
actually leads me to my next question, which is how does a parent navigate advocating for their family without getting kicked out of their physician's practice for noncompliance?
If you get kicked out of your practice for noncompliance, good, because you don't have a physician who's looking out for your best interests. If you, as a parent, have asked your physician to work with you and your child in a bio-individual way and they're not hearing you, you need to find another physician. And there are other physicians out there. I know that feels overwhelming. I know people love their pediatricians, but if they're not honoring your request to do things in a bio-individual way, then they just aren't up to speed on the latest way medicine is practiced. This is where medicine is going. It's coming out of the 19th century factory model, which is one size fits all, a pill for every ill. So there are physicians out there who will accommodate and will respect what you want to do as a parent. You just have to look a little harder sometimes.
Well, everything that we're talking about requires, at least in the beginning, a heavy lift, right? Like we're talking about lots and lots of time. My brother has cerebral palsy, and my mom had the flexibility to advocate for him and spend hours on the phone finding the right community, not just for medical, but also social. And, doctors can't usually even give recommendations outside the guidelines that are approved by the insurance companies.
Mhm.
So there is just so much here that's daunting and really from a place of, I'll say, privilege, because if your insurance can't cover it, that means that you have to have the money to pay for the other doctor who works independently of insurance companies. So there's so much here that a mom who's working two jobs, let's say, she doesn't have the time to do all this stuff, and it is overwhelming. And then we kind of swing back to the other side of the thought pendulum and go, well, gosh, though, isn't it worth at least like trying part of it or some of it? And I think that's where your community comes in. And so as we wrap up today, I'd love for you to share how people can engage with your community and how information is filtered, because we have all been in a Facebook community where we were like, wow, this person is off the rails, and we don't want our precious future, our kids, to be subject to someone do an FMT collection in a basement in Panama, right? Like, and also from a US government perspective, those autism numbers, they were high in the year 2020.
Mhm.
If you were born in 2020, you are eligible of age for military service. How is the US military supposed to handle an incoming flux of prospective recruits who have neurodivergent needs and can't therefore defend the future of our country? Like, this is important, right?
Mhm.
But it's like I swing back and forth going, God, who has time to do all this? To like, oh my gosh, this is like super important. So tell us how we can find your community, how parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles can plug into that community.
Right. Well, I think I just want to address what you said about sort of the inaccessibility of so much of what I'm talking about. It feels really inaccessible because insurance doesn't cover the natural medicine stuff, the functional medicine labs, et cetera. And that is a broken system. So that is something that we collectively need to lock arm in arm about and start making changes to our system because our what we're paying for right now is pharmaceuticals. We're paying for surgeries and pharmaceuticals and hospital visits, but that's not what's going to prevent or reverse these conditions. So that is a bigger problem that if we don't deal with, as you said, it's a national security crisis. We have a societal collapse. We're going to break under the pressure of this epidemic of chronic illness in our kids because we will not have a future of healthy kids. So we feel like that starts all at home and starts with community. It does feel so overwhelming to the average parent because it's just like, I have to change my whole life. But if you start banding together with other parents doing this, all of a sudden it feels normalized. So we created an online community. It's called Healing Together, where we are inviting everybody in to join us and to join our new normal. This is where we are teaching parents how to do the diet changes, how to do the lifestyle changes. We've curated all the information and we're sharing it with parents so they don't feel like a deer in headlights and like confused about what's out there. We do live calls twice a month with an integrative physician and health coaches so that we can answer people's questions. And then you can meet other parents who are on the same journey with you. So, my point is just that we have a big problem ahead of us. This is a massive epidemic that's hitting our kids. But we know that if we band together, if we work in community, we can not only heal our kids, but we can change the system. But we have to start getting together and banding into a group that has the capacity to make the changes that are critical to our future.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing, the way that you are helping with that heavy lift. I appreciate it. And I'm sure listeners who have family members or friends with autism, that they appreciate it too, because it's an interesting time that we're in where we are announcing our children's medical status on social media. You know, little Johnny has autism, but we're not allowed to ask the why and the what now. And I think that we really took a good first step into that today. So thank you again. I'll link everything in the show notes and I appreciate you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.